Hello there guys, and welcome back to another installment of what I decided to call Ancient Cribs, a series in which I attempt to rebuild and examine the houses of famous figures in history. In this second installment of the series, I wanted to go big, and who would be bigger than the Son of God himself? When I was trying to compile a list of archaeological ruins associated with famous people, there was one that kept popping up. For obvious reasons, the modern city of Nazareth is jam-packed with dozens of religious buildings, many of which claim to have once been the sites of historical and biblical significance. From the exact spot where Mary was told by the Archangel Gabriel she would give birth to the Messiah, to a site supposedly built on top of the shop where Jesus worked. Despite a steady influx of Christian pilgrims every year, few of these sites possess hard evidence to back up their claims. However, one relatively young and somewhat unimpressive building in the lineup deserves some consideration. The Sisters of Nazareth Convent was founded by a group of French nuns in 1881. When they purchased the site from locals, some claimed that the land had once been the location of a great church and the tomb of a saint. These stories were initially taken with a grain of salt, but as construction of the convent continued, the nuns discovered that their building was in fact being built on top of a Byzantine-era church. More serious excavations occurred much later under archaeologist Ken Dark, and these revealed something even more interesting, a structure even older beneath that. Somewhat unexpectedly, underneath the medieval church, Dark and his team discovered the ruins of a building dated to 2,000 years ago, the 1st century AD. It is not surprising that at the time this led to considerable excitement. News outlets quickly reported that the childhood home of Jesus had been discovered, and to this day, pilgrims flock to the convent in the hope of seeing the house where the Messiah grew up. But, and I know I'm going to sound like a real jerk here, is it really? What was actually found during the excavations, and can we really say who it belonged to? Today, let us take a deep dive into the house of Jesus. Nobody chooses when they get sick. In ancient times, it seemed like people could rely on miracles to help them get better. But unfortunately today, miracles are in much shorter supply. When I was living outside my home state for a couple months, I unexpectedly needed to find a dentist to help fix my tooth. However, I was far away from my usual provider. I would have had to either fly home or just wait until I got back. Both options were not realistic or healthy. So I decided to find a temporary dentist in the area to address the problem as soon as possible. And to do this, I relied on ZocDoc, today's sponsor. ZocDoc is a free-to-use online website that helps you discover health providers in your local area. ZocDoc allows you to search and compare within a database of more than 150,000 in-network doctors and professionals across all 50 states of the US. Their website provides users with hundreds of reviews from real patients to help you choose the doctor best suited for the job. Not only that, but their interface allows you to see actual openings at a doctor's practice and book appointments with just the simple click of a button. I can speak from experience that ZocDoc makes finding and booking a doctor much more efficient. In the case of my tooth, I was able to find a doctor within the week. Taking care of your health just got a lot easier. Click the link below or go to ZocDoc.com/TradeTheExplainer to get started and check that appointment off your to-do list. And thanks again to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video. Alright, back to the show. The Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, represent our earliest detailed sources on the figure known to history as Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus Christ. And one thing they all seem to agree on, at least to an extent, is that he was from a very specific place. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is famously referred to as Jesus ho Nazareos, Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Nazarene, a title that not only told his followers where he was from, but was meant to differentiate him from the countless other men named Jesus apparently walking around at the time. The place Nazareth itself is mentioned several times in the Gospels, rendered into Greek variously as Nazareth, Nazaret, or Nazarah. The Gospel of Luke refers to it as a polis Galilaea, or city of Galilee, a region north of Judea. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all refer to Nazareth as Jesus' patria atu, his own native place or hometown, and we can assume he spent the majority of his off-page life here. Nazareth also appears as a setting for an episode recorded in all three Gospels, in which Jesus, upon returning to his hometown early in his ministry, is chased out for preaching in its synagogue. It is here that the Bible provides us with the only detail on its geography. Nazareth apparently had a cliff or hillside, which the inhabitants could chuck people off. Now, there's a bit of debate surrounding if Nazareth itself was more than just the place where Jesus grew up. The Gospel of Mark is the earliest Gospel, and the one that Luke and Matthew are at least partially derived. Although Mark does not describe Jesus' birth in the text, we are given every indication by the author that Nazareth was probably where he was born. It is only in the slightly later sources, Luke and Matthew, that we hear accounts of Jesus' birth elsewhere. Luke, for example, claims Mary and Joseph were originally from Nazareth, but were forced to travel to Bethlehem because of a Roman census, only to return back to Nazareth shortly after Jesus' birth. Matthew, on the other hand, makes no mention of the census and seems to imply that Mary and Joseph resided in Bethlehem from the start, living in a house they owned. It is only because of King Herod's persecution that the family is forced to flee to Egypt for an extended but unspecified period of time. Eventually, Joseph is told by God in a dream to return to the land of Israel, and made his home in a town called Nazareth. This confusion has led some scholars to propose that the historical Jesus was in fact born and raised in the obscure town of Nazareth, hence why our earliest sources like the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Mark don't spend much time discussing it. It seems like it was only later sources that felt the need to translocate Jesus' birth to somewhere else, such as the more prophetically important location of Bethlehem. Nazareth and Jesus' connection to it has an interesting history. The earliest instance in which we ever hear of a town going by that name is the Gospel of Mark. The slightly older letters of the Apostle Paul curiously make no mention of Jesus' hometown, nor his birthplace. So from literary sources alone, the location of Nazareth seems to just pop into existence around 70 AD. Some Jesus mythicists, scholars who believe Jesus himself did not exist, have used this fact to claim even the town he came from was an invention of the Gospel authors. But I think this takes things a bit too far. Absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. Just because a location isn't mentioned in our surviving records doesn't mean it did not exist. As we will see later, there is clear archaeological evidence that the modern site identified for thousands of years as Nazareth did in fact possess a small Jewish community that predated the Gospels and Christianity. The apparent lack of non-biblical references to it can simply be attributed to the town being so insignificant and obscure that no one in the wider world seemed to take any interest in Nazareth until a man from the town became famous. Think Jimmy Carter and Plains, Georgia. So, if Nazareth was a real place inhabited by Jews in the 1st century AD during the life of Jesus, what was it like exactly? From what has been uncovered so far, Nazareth existed as a Jewish settlement at least as far back as the late Hellenistic period after the conquest of Alexander the Great. It was located near the Sea of Galilee, on a series of hills overlooking a fertile valley. As described by the Gospels, it had steep cliffs, and we know from the archaeological excavations many of Nazareth's buildings were partially terraced from the hillsides. The early church father Jerome's assessment that the place was a, quote, small village appears to be accurate. Contrary to Luke's label of polis, Nazareth was a very small hamlet. Rough estimates have put its population somewhere between 100 to 500 people at most, with a number around 200 being most likely. It was bigger than several nearby settlements in the region and may have served as a central marketplace, but by no means was it important. By the time of Jesus, that title clearly belonged to a town on the opposite end of the valley, 6 kilometers or about an hour's walk away. Sepphoris was a major urban center and probably the largest town in the immediate area, boasting a population of a few thousand people. Although much like most of the valley it was primarily Jewish, from the artifacts uncovered in Sepphoris we can tell it was multicultural and had a heavy Roman influence, so much so that it possessed a pagan temple. The Jews in Nazareth, on the other hand, were much humbler. The church father St. John Chrysostom once called it a, quote, miserable village, which might be a bit harsh but does give you a rough idea of the place. As far as we can tell, the town lacked public buildings or any form of infrastructure. It was simply a collection of houses, shops, and areas given over to agriculture. This perhaps amounted to somewhere between 10 to 20 homes. The inhabitants of Nazareth were likely a simple people. Olive and wine presses indicate that they primarily made their living through farming. It is easy to imagine the hillsides covered in vineyards and groves. Excavations have revealed that terraces were cut into the landscape specifically for agriculture, and these would have been used to produce figs, almonds, wheat, and barley. Livestock such as cattle, sheep, and goats were also probably raised here and tended to by shepherds. We know from similar settlements, Nazareth's families would have worked the land together in what was basically a tight-knit commune. As far as we can tell, the Nazarenes were neither exceptionally wealthy nor particularly impoverished. There is no evidence of wealth gradation in their valley. Unlike other places in the Roman Empire, the farmers were not slaves or tenants. They owned the land they farmed, and were capable of feeding themselves, paying their taxes, and maybe even making a small profit from surpluses. But they certainly weren't rich. Their world would have been small and unremarkable, taking things day by day. During the Roman period, there were at least 6 to 7 limestone quarries near Nazareth, and it seems probable, like many rural communities in the Roman Empire, the town supplemented its income by quarrying stone. Part-time masons would take a break from herding or farming to cut and shape heavy blocks so they could be sold off as building material for other settlements. Jesus and his father Joseph very well could have been part of this workforce. The Gospel of Mark claims that Jesus, and in some versions his father, were tektons. This Greek word, traditionally translated as carpenters, was much less specific in an ancient context. A tekton was a craftsman associated with building, and therefore the word could have just as equally applied to stonemasons or quarrymen. Something unique about Nazareth that archaeologists like Professor Ken Dark have noticed has been the fact that all the objects used by people in settlements near and in Nazareth itself were produced by Jews. This can be contrasted with settlements to the north near Sepphoris. In these sites, a mix of Jewish and Gentile artifacts can be found. There appears to have been a rough division across the valley between pro-Roman Jews to the north and religiously conservative Jews to the south. Ken Dark has argued that this might suggest the inhabitants near and in Nazareth during the 1st century wanted to isolate themselves and emphasize their Jewish identity, perhaps like an Amish community today. They resisted and rejected the influence of the Roman invaders, and it is very likely that this was motivated by strong religious convictions and a strict adherence to Jewish purity laws. It was within this possibly anti-Roman and highly religious community that the man Jesus was said to have grown up. And so finally, we arrive back at the structure beneath the modern Sisters of Nazareth Convent. As with any building in the Holy Land, the convent has an incredibly complicated history. For over 2,000 years, people have been building houses, living in them, and then smashing them down, only to build them back up again. And in no place is this process more apparent than underneath the Sisters' Convent. To give you a brief overview of the site, the modern convent was built on top of the ruins of a grand 5th century Byzantine church, which itself possessed a crypt that was originally an older 4th century cave church. But that's not all. This cave church had been cut from 1st and 2nd century Jewish tombs, which themselves seem to have been partially cut through a building that was once part of a natural cave on the hillside when Nazareth was first settled. Don't be ashamed if you're confused, this is one of the messiest archaeological sites I've ever seen. What matters is that gradually peeling back the site's layers reveals that at its core, there was once a man-made structure that can be pretty firmly dated to the 1st century AD. All that remains of this building today are just 2 walls, a room, and a tiny patch of the original dirt floor. Wall 1 was solid stone, chiseled from what was originally a natural limestone cave on the hillside. Wall 2 was built of stacked stone blocks, but at one point it was rebuilt and reinforced during the Crusades. And the room, called the Chamber Obscure, was a small chamber that, like Wall 1, was partially cut from the natural rock. And that's it. That's all that remains of the building that predated the churches and tombs. The area between Wall 1 and Wall 2 in the Chamber Obscure has been tentatively called Structure 1. Artifacts linked with Structure 1, such as fragments of pottery, vessels, and a spindle whorl, suggest that it was a domestic building, or in other words, a house, where people cooked food and wove textiles. Structure 1 likely represents the barest of bones of a Nazareth dwelling, dating all the way back to the time of Jesus. And this is why it has been called the home or house of Jesus. Scholars like Ken Dark have used these walls and more well-preserved houses of this period and region as a model to extrapolate what the rest of the building may have looked like in its heyday. This has led to the theorized Courtyard House model, and I'll be using a modified version of this model to give a brief house tour, once again reconstructed in Minecraft. We have no way of truly knowing how big Structure 1 once was, or its layout, besides maybe 2 rooms, so a lot of what I will say is hypothetical, and maybe or may have been, rather than there was. From the surviving evidence, the Courtyard House model for the site seems probable, and this layout was pretty standard for Galilean houses of this period, with only slight variations in orientation and scale. As its name would imply, the Courtyard House would have been surrounded by a high stone wall, centered around a courtyard. We might think of it today as a compound. This courtyard would have been an open area with cisterns for collecting water from runoff and maybe a tree for shade. There also may have been animal pens. The house proper would have been small, likely just 1 story with a limited arrangement of rectangular rooms. From just the remains of Structure 1 alone, we can say that it could have comfortably housed, by the standards of the 1st century, 9 or 10 people, and in typical ancient fashion, this would have represented the immediate family and some extended relatives like grandparents and uncles. The features we know best about this house were its walls. Structure 1 had been built into a hillside, utilizing a natural cave. When it was first constructed, its builders created a terrace into the hill. During this likely work and time-intensive process, they carved and retained a stone wall in its western side, called Wall 1 by archaeologists. This decision was extremely clever and shows a level of brilliance in the architect or architects. A solid stone wall like this would have been far stronger than one built of mortared stone, and was also better at keeping out the cold and rain. Structure 1's builders also had the foresight to leave a natural rock overhang on the east side of the wall, likely to provide support for the roof of the building. On the west side, they carved stairs into the stone, which could have been used to scale the roof from the outside of the house. They even chiseled a doorway through a stone wall, likely connecting the main room formed by Wall 1 to a smaller natural cave, which would become the Chamber Obscure. The rest of the house was then built around these rock-cut elements. As Ken Dark writes in his book, all this took considerable knowledge of stoneworking and of the structural properties of the rock. Whoever constructed Wall 1 and its rock-cut stairway was an unusual skillful stoneworker. A lot of this knowledge can at least in part be credited to Nazareth's quarry workforce, and it wouldn't be surprising to learn that the inhabitants of Structure 1 were quarrymen themselves. As for the rest of the building, we can't say much. The areas between walls 1 and 2 were likely the bedroom of the house, where the family collectively slept. The Chamber Obscure seems to have been a storage pit or silo for grain, or some other type of crop, based on its lack of windows and the presence of a rock-cut pit. Other rooms probably included a family living room or dining area, and maybe a workshop or second storeroom. But these areas, and even their vague outlines, have been completely lost to time, so it's hard to say anything about them. One thing we can say is that the roof of the building would have been flat, and likely accessible by those stairs carved into Wall 1. In the summer, the inhabitants of the house would probably have slept on top, to escape the stuffy heat of the indoors. On this roof, a Nazarene boy could have drifted asleep after a tiring day of herding sheep or pressing olives, looking up at the clear, twinkling stars above. Who lived in Structure 1? That is the million, maybe even billion-dollar question, and probably the thing I expect you, the viewer, want to know most. When the discovery of Structure 1 was first announced to the world, it was almost always discussed by the media in terms of the childhood house of Jesus in some capacity. And to this day, countless Christians around the world firmly believe these walls were once the literal home of Christ. First off, let's be clear that no scientific publication has ever made this claim. Again, presupposing that Jesus was a historical figure who grew up in the town of Nazareth, nothing about Structure 1 indicates that it could have been his or his family's dwelling. It could have just as easily belonged to one of the many other families who lived in Nazareth at that time. It's important to stress that all we have are a few walls. The scientific evidence can only say that these walls were probably the remains of a house from that period, contemporary with Jesus, but not necessarily his. We can't say if Jesus actually lived here. But, and this is an important point, it's worth pointing out that we can't entirely rule out that possibility either. One of the lead archaeologists at the Sisters of Nazareth Convent, an excavator of Structure 1, Ken Dark, has publicly admitted that though the likelihood of this being the historical Jesus' house is low, it's not impossible. Nazareth in the 1st century AD was a very small community, and therefore the probability of someone randomly selecting the ruins of a house, and that house actually being associated with Jesus, would depend, in part on the number of houses that the Nazareth of his day had in total. As Dark explains in a hypothetical experiment, if 1st century Nazareth had 20 houses, a possibility for a community of say 200 people, then the probability of correctly identifying a specific house would be 5%. If the settlement had just 10 houses, there would be a 10% chance. I think it's also worth pointing out that the construction of Wall 1 is consistent with a practiced stonemason, which, yes, could fit the tecton description of Joseph or Jesus described by the Gospels. It's very weak evidence, I'll admit, but it's something. Even if they didn't live here, it's possible that one or both of them may have contributed to the building of Structure 1. It was a small town after all. Lastly, the strongest evidence cited for this building being the house of Jesus are the writings of an Irish monk named Adamnan. In his work De Loco Sanctis, Adamnan claims to have spoken to a bishop named Arculfus, who apparently visited Nazareth during the 7th century AD. In his own account, Arculfus gives the description of a now lost church named the Church of the Nutrition, which appears to match the 5th century one that existed prior to the Sisters of Nazareth Convent. And curiously, at one point, almost offhandedly, Arculfus states that this church was, quote, raised where once upon a time was the house in which the Lord our Savior was brought up. This very well could be the earliest reference to our Structure 1, and it seems that by the Middle Ages at least, it was thought of as the house that Jesus grew up in. Admittedly, the source of this information is pretty late and hazy. Not only is Adamnan just relating a story that another person told him, but the earliest record of this tradition is coming 600 years after the death of Jesus. Can we truly say the memory of who lived in this ruin was accurately handed down for 20 generations? Additionally, there are countless Christian pilgrims who visited Nazareth much earlier than Arculfus, who make no mention of such a tradition. It's equally plausible that this was a made-up tall tale created long after the fact to attract pilgrims. Again, there's no way to tell. All we can say is that by the 7th century, Christians at least thought Jesus may have lived in this building, and this belief, now revitalized by the archaeological excavations, continues to this day. As we close out, I thought it would be fitting to end on a somewhat melancholic note, which would be keeping with this series so far. If Structure 1 was in fact the real house of Jesus, its story and current state is a rather sad one. Across 2,000 years of history, the building has undoubtedly been thoroughly torn to shreds. And this has seemingly almost been done entirely by Jesus' own followers, bashing down its walls and building new ones. It is perhaps one of the greatest ironies of history that someone like the Bronze Age scammer Natsir, who lived over 1,000 years before Jesus, could have such a well-preserved home, while the house of one of the most influential and reportedly kindest people in history has been destroyed almost beyond recognition. Such are the strange fates in the field of archaeology.